There are nights that never truly end, even after the sun rises, even after the noise of life begins again. And for me, those nights started during the war, nights when the cold didn't just settle into your bones, but into your breath, into the hollows behind your eyes, into the pages of letters folded so many times that the creases had become scars of their own. And yet, within that cold, within that silence broken only by distant gunfire and the creak of boots on frozen earth, there was something, someone, who kept me warm in ways no blanket or fire ever could. She wrote with a hand that trembled only slightly, on pale stationery that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, each envelope sealed with care, each word chosen as if it might be the last I'd ever read from her. And when I received those letters, sometimes smuggled through mess halls, sometimes slipped quietly into my cot during overnight shifts, I didn't read them all at once because they were more than ink and paper. They were time itself, stretched and folded into the space between life and death, between home and hell. Marianne, her name written in the top corner of every page in that same graceful loop, didn't just write about daily life or politics or even the war that loomed over every thought we had. Instead, she wrote about light, how it moved across the hardwood floor of her apartment in the morning, how it struck the window pane in the library where she still worked part-time, how she imagined it would fall across my face if I ever came back home. And through those descriptions, she built for me a world that felt intact, untouched, still waiting. I kept her letters folded and tucked into the inside pocket of my field coat, the one I wore through the Ardennes, through the bitter cold of late 1944, and even through those weeks in the hospital when the painkillers blurred everything but her handwriting. And on nights when I couldn't sleep, nights when memory and fear strangled the air from my lungs, I'd press my fingers to that pocket, feel the soft crinkle of the paper, and remember that there was once a world where someone loved me enough to write about the sun. For years after the war, I kept them, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, because in a life filled with uncertainty and ghosts, they were the one thing I knew had truly happened. I moved from job to job, town to town, tried to rebuild some kind of rhythm, but she was gone. No forwarding address, no phone call, no answer from the old house where I once watched her hang laundry under the early fall sky. Some said she moved to the West Coast. Others thought she'd married and changed her name. Some even claimed she'd never really existed, just a phantom created by the war. But I knew better. I had her words, and I had the silence that came when they stopped. And then, years later, older and slower, walking through a square in downtown Providence, a place I never meant to stop in but somehow always passed through, I saw her. She was standing still, as if waiting for a bus that had long since stopped running, with her scarf tucked under her chin, and her hands wrapped tightly around something small, maybe a letter, maybe time itself. And the moment I saw her, the wind stopped, the city quieted, and every page she had ever written came rushing back to life. If this story touches your heart like it did mine as I wrote it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. I met Marianne in the spring of 1940, during a season that bloomed too quietly that year, as if the world itself had begun to hold its breath, knowing what was coming, though none of us could yet name it aloud. The first time I saw her, she was shelving books in the back room of the public library in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the kind of room that always smelled of dust and pine cleaner, with old linoleum floors that creaked beneath your shoes no matter how softly you tried to walk. Her mother was the head librarian and ran the place like a chapel. No loud voices, no careless hands, no unreturned books. But Marianne moved through that space like sunlight touches water, effortlessly, gracefully, illuminating everything in her path. We were just kids then, though we pretended otherwise, both of us just over 20, convinced that the world could be reshaped by the way we read a line of Dickinson or the hush that fell between verses of Whitman. Our country hadn't yet entered the war, but the air was already thick with the tension of headlines and broadcasts, with murmurs about Europe and rationing, and young men signing up early. Still, in that quiet library, we found something untouched, a little loft above the reading room, filled with yellowing newspapers, surplus chairs, forgotten atlases, and an old wooden beam into which we carved our initials one afternoon with a pocket knife I carried everywhere, JM plus MH. We didn't say what it meant, we didn't need to. We spent long hours up there, leaning against the stacks, whispering lines of poetry to each other, as though sharing secrets. Sometimes we would sit in silence, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the sound of pages turning below, or the distant bell of the trolley as it passed the corner. She had a laugh that came softly, like a sigh you didn't want to end, and eyes that never left you unchanged once they looked your way. Marianne had a habit of tucking her hair behind one ear when she was thinking, and I still remember the exact curve of that motion, like a phrase in a song that you replay in your mind for decades. When the draft came in 1942, we didn't make a scene. There was no dramatic goodbye at the train station, no tearful promises shouted over the noise of departure. Instead, she handed me a single letter, tied with red thread, and said quietly, "Read it when you need it most." I didn't open it right away. I kept it in the front pocket of my jacket next to my dog tags as I boarded a troop train heading south to basic training, and later onto ships bound for Europe. Inside that envelope was a typed copy of a poem, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," Walt Whitman again, always Whitman, with her handwritten note at the bottom, "You will come home, and I will be waiting with lilacs in a jar." I read that poem more times than I can count, sometimes during breaks in the barracks, sometimes by flashlight under a canvas tent, and later in foxholes dug hurriedly at the edge of nowhere. It became a part of me, each line, each space, each promise, like another breath I couldn't afford to lose. She wrote to me faithfully, once a month, sometimes more. Her handwriting remained steady, even when the world around us faltered. She described the things that don't make it into history books, the way her father insisted on keeping their small garden despite rationing, the neighbor's dog that barked at the milkman every morning, the local movie house that still played matinees on Saturdays. She told me how her fingers had gone raw from knitting scarves for the Red Cross, and how the old sycamore tree behind the library had finally split during a storm. She never mentioned fear, not hers, not mine, but I could feel it between the lines, in the way she paused between paragraphs, in the ink that sometimes smeared where her hand must have trembled. I replied when I could, scrawling sentences on scraps of military-issue stationery, using a pencil dull from too much use. I told her things I didn't tell anyone else, about the boys in my unit, about the silence before combat, about the way time seemed to expand and collapse in the same breath. I always signed my letters the same way, "Yours, until the world is quiet again." I never knew if they reached her, but writing them was the only way I stayed human. Those letters became a lifeline, not just for love, but for sanity. They reminded me of who I had been before the uniforms, before the trenches, before the steel helmets and coded orders. They were our bridge across the dark water. Every time a bundle of mail arrived, I would dig through it with shaking hands, praying to see her handwriting. When one arrived, I didn't tear it open immediately. I waited for the quiet. I read them alone, carefully, like scripture, savoring every word, because they were not just updates from home. They were Marianne herself, reaching across the ocean, wrapping her arms around me without ever touching me. But near the end of 1944, they stopped. No explanation, no warning, just silence. War does not begin with a bang, at least not the kind you hear. It begins with the slow erosion of the world you once recognized, with the soft, steady disappearance of familiar faces, with long train rides where no one speaks, and uniforms that itch in the summer heat, and orders printed in ink so cold and impersonal it feels like reading your own fate carved into stone. For me, war began the moment Marianne's letters stopped arriving, and everything that came after, gunfire, explosions, long marches through ruined villages, was merely the echo of that silence growing louder. When I shipped out to Europe, the world was still wide in my mind, still filled with doorways I would someday walk through again, still bright with the possibility of reunion. I landed in France in the early days, after the Normandy invasion, when the air still smelled of ash and the countryside bore fresh wounds from the fighting. We advanced through hedgerows and narrow, winding roads, where every corner held the potential for ambush, and yet, even then, I carried hope the way some men carried a lucky coin or a rosary. I carried it folded 4 times in the inside pocket of my coat, pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat. Marianne's last letter. It was dated March 1944. She wrote about the apple tree behind her mother's house finally blooming, about a child she saw on the trolley reading a book far too advanced for his age, about the way the evenings were longer now, with the golden light stretching across the porch, just the way I used to like it. At the bottom of the page, she had written in smaller, tighter script, "I'm afraid. I don't know what's coming next, but I'm still waiting." I read those words under a broken moon, surrounded by men I barely knew, with my rifle resting across my knees and the world humming with an unease none of us dared to name aloud. After that, nothing. No letters in April, none in May. Not a single envelope, as the summer passed into the hell of winter combat in the Ardennes, where cold wasn't just temperature, but a state of mind, and you stopped expecting warmth to ever return. I asked the mail clerk if he'd seen anything for me. He shook his head. I checked again 2 days later, and again. Eventually, he stopped answering. The others noticed. I could see it in the way they averted their eyes when the mail came, in the way they spoke to me a little softer, as if they were already offering condolences for a loss I hadn't yet confirmed. By the time we pushed into Belgium, I had memorized Marianne's last letter. I carried it through mud, through snow, through shrapnel and fever. It lived under my skin. Some nights, I read it again just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. I tried writing back anyway. 3, 4, 5 letters. I wrote from trenches and barracks, from makeshift hospitals and transport trucks. I wrote in the back of my field journal. I wrote on scraps of map paper in the backs of old orders. I told her I was alive. I told her I dreamed of her voice. I told her the lilacs she promised were all I could think about when the bombs fell. I never knew if those letters reached her. I never would. What no one tells you about war is that the loudest part is not the gunfire, not the screaming, not the rush of blood in your ears. It's the quiet that comes afterward, the unbearable silence of survival, the strange hush that settles when the smoke clears and you're left standing while someone else is not. In that silence, every unanswered letter becomes heavier. Every absence echoes like artillery. I began to wonder if maybe she had moved on, found someone else, someone who wasn't just a memory dressed in khaki. Or maybe she thought I was dead, or maybe she was. When the war ended, I returned to the States a different man, older not just in years, but in ways I couldn't explain. The medals they pinned to my chest felt heavier than the wounds I came home with. I stepped off the train into a Boston that looked like it had gone on living without me, and I wandered through its streets with the unease of someone who no longer belonged. I went to her old address, a quiet house with a white fence and wind chimes that I remembered clearly. It was gone, torn down, rebuilt, now housing 2 college students who'd never heard the name Marianne Holloway. I went to the library next, the one where we met, renovated, modern. The little loft above the reading room was gone. The beam where we carved our initials was now painted over, plastered into a wall that no longer remembered our names. I asked around. Neighbors, old friends. I called city offices and checked hospital registries. Some said she'd gone west, California maybe. Others said she married a soldier, changed her last name, settled down in some quiet suburb. One old family friend told me in hushed tones that her father had died suddenly in 1944 and that afterward she'd become reclusive, hard to reach. But no one had a forwarding address. No one had seen her in decades. She had disappeared into the same silence that had swallowed so many things during the war. I kept looking for a time. I wrote letters to possible addresses, but they were returned unopened. I left my name at reunion boards, posted notices in veteran groups. Nothing. Eventually, even the trail of rumors went cold. I didn't know if she was alive or if she had simply become another name on a list somewhere, buried not by bombs but by time. And so I carried her with me in the only way I could, in my thoughts, in the space her letters once occupied, in the rhythm of my footsteps through the city, in the echo of her voice when I tried to remember what love sounded like before the silence. I never stopped writing, but the words I sent went unanswered, and the void where she had once been grew until it filled everything. After the war ended and her letters ceased without explanation, I found myself haunted not only by the memories of battle and the faces of men I left behind, but by the growing emptiness in my hands, where once her envelopes had rested, warm from the postman's fingers, smelling faintly of lavender and a life I could almost remember if I closed my eyes. That silence, colder than winter on the front lines, stretched across the years like a shadow I couldn't outrun, and I soon realized that if I didn't write something, anything, I might lose her entirely, and with her, the part of myself that had once belonged to someone. It began, as most things do, quietly. An old journal I found while helping my neighbor move, the kind with a weathered leather cover and thin ivory pages that creaked slightly when you turned them, as if whispering that they hadn't yet been trusted with anything worth remembering. I took it home and let it sit on my desk for weeks. I didn't know what I would write. I didn't want to start it with grief, and yet one evening, in the quiet of my apartment, with the radio humming static in the background and a cup of black coffee going cold on the windowsill, I opened to the first page and wrote her name, Marianne. I stared at that word for a long time, how it curved across the page, how much space it filled, how much weight it carried, and it felt like calling someone across a great distance and hearing nothing but the echo of your own voice. Still, I kept writing. I wrote as if the war had never ended, as if my letters were still traveling toward her. I told her about the sound of Boston at night, the trolley lines groaning, the echo of footsteps on wet sidewalks, the hiss of steam rising from grates in the winter. I told her about the men who didn't come back, and the ones who did but weren't the same. I told her about the small apartment I rented above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon every morning, and how I often found myself watching strangers, wondering if they, too, were waiting for someone who had disappeared into silence. Over time, the journal became more than just a place to preserve her memory. It became the place I returned to when the world felt too loud or too hollow, the place I poured into every word I couldn't speak aloud. I slipped in photographs of places we had dreamed of visiting, ticket stubs from movies I saw alone, pressed leaves that reminded me of her hair. I copied poems, hers and mine, and taped them between entries. I wasn't keeping a diary, I was building a monument, not made of stone, but of ink and paper, and the defiant hope that some things once written never die. Years passed. The world moved on without asking my permission. Men I once stood beside started families, moved to suburbs, built lives that I couldn't bring myself to imagine. I never married. There were chances, quiet, kind women who offered warmth, companionship, something resembling home. But none of them were Marianne. None of them understood the weight of words left unsaid. I carried her like a folded letter in my chest, and it felt like betrayal to hand that space to anyone else. In the 1980s, when my work as a proofreader for a small publishing house dried up and Boston began to feel more like a memory than a city, I packed my things and moved south to Providence, Rhode Island. Not for any particular reason, not for a job or a new start, but because I had a strange, persistent feeling that if she had survived, if she had rebuilt her life, she might have chosen a place like this. Quieter, slower, with its brick alleys and overgrown ivy, its bookstores and parks, and the kind of soft anonymity that makes it easy to disappear without being entirely gone. I rented a one-bedroom apartment near the College Hill area, just off a cobblestone street lined with old gas lamps and maple trees that turned gold every fall. I kept the journal by my bed, still writing, less frequently perhaps, but no less urgently. My entries became more reflective, less desperate. I stopped begging the universe for answers. I began to write to her, not as someone who might come back, but as someone who had never really left. I described the light through my window in October, the way the scent of baking bread drifted up from the corner deli, the sound of students laughing as they walked to class, reminding me of our youth in a way that ached without bitterness. I began to walk, daily, religiously, through the city's small squares and neglected gardens, past bronze statues and iron benches, imagining her around every corner. Not the Marianne I knew, not the girl from the library, but a woman with silver in her hair and the same gentle seriousness in her eyes. I didn't expect a miracle. I just needed to keep looking, because looking meant I hadn't forgotten, because walking meant I still believed there was something left to find. Sometimes I would stop at a cafe with wide windows and sit for an hour, drinking weak coffee and watching the world go by. I wondered if she did the same, if she kept her own journal, if she ever passed a bench and thought she saw me, if she ever doubted I was real. And when those thoughts became too much, I would go home, light a small lamp on the desk, and write again. Marianne, I saw the first snow today. Marianne, I heard a song on the radio that reminded me of your voice. Marianne, I haven't stopped waiting. The journal by then was heavy with time, pages worn soft with use, corners curled, ink faded, but still it lived. Still it held the weight of a love that had nowhere else to go. Still it spoke back to me, in her voice, in mine, in the silence between sentences where we used to live. It was a day that began like any other, with the gentle rustling of leaves against the window pane, the quiet hum of morning traffic down on Benefit Street, and the smell of damp brick rising from the sidewalks after a night of autumn rain. A day unremarkable in every way except for a quiet pull I couldn't explain, a vague sense of anticipation that lingered just beneath the skin, as though memory itself were nudging me forward towards something I wasn't yet ready to name. I had no errands to run, no appointments to keep, and yet I found myself wandering through the east side of Providence, past the weathered steps of brownstones and the stoic iron fences guarding half-forgotten gardens, until I reached a small square tucked between a crumbling church and a shuttered bookstore, a square I must have passed 100 times before without ever really seeing it, and at morning, wrapped in wind and silence, it felt like the kind of place where time paused to take a breath. The trees were thinning, their branches etched against a silver sky, and the wind carried with it the scent of cold earth and old paper, and I sat on one of the wrought iron benches, letting the air fill my lungs as I watched the leaves tumble past my feet, amber and ochre and gold, dancing like pages caught in a breeze, and I thought just for a moment how strange it was to feel so close to a thing I couldn't name. And then I saw her. She was walking slowly, carefully, one hand pressed against the small of her back, the other wrapped tightly around the strap of a worn canvas handbag, and she wore a navy wool coat buttoned to her chin and a soft blue scarf tied beneath it, the kind of scarf I hadn't seen in decades, but remembered perfectly, as if it had waited in some drawer all these years for this very morning. And there was something in her gait, unhurried but purposeful, that made my breath catch before I even saw her face. She didn't look at me at first. She walked past the fountain, now dry for the season, and stopped beneath a tree whose last leaves clung desperately to their branches, and for a long moment she simply stood there, as if listening for something, as if waiting for a sound only she could hear. And then she turned. Our eyes met the way stars might align after decades of drifting, not suddenly but slowly, with the weight of everything we had carried between us. And I stood, not even knowing I had risen, my legs unsteady, my breath shallow, and in that quiet second, the world did not collapse or rejoice or shout. It simply stilled, as if it too had been waiting. She took a step toward me, hesitant at first, and then another, and in those few feet of distance I felt 40 years unravel, not vanish, not erase, but unwind gently, like a ribbon being loosened from a letter long unopened. And when she was close enough to see the lines time had etched into my face, and I could see the way her hands trembled just slightly with each breath, she spoke my name. "Julian?" And the sound of it, tender, uncertain, barely above a whisper, landed in my chest like the first rain after a long drought, and I answered not with words at first, but with a look I hoped would hold everything I couldn't say. "Yes, I'm here. I never left. I never stopped." "Marianne," I finally said, my voice thick with years, and she smiled in the way that people do when they've cried too long to cry again, and then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft with age, its edges frayed and yellowed like something sacred, and she held it out to me with the kind of care usually reserved for glass or memory. I took it from her, already knowing what it was, the last letter I sent, the one I wasn't sure had ever reached her, and as my fingers closed around it, I could feel the years inside, could feel the silence pressing gently against the paper, not with blame, but with the kind of understanding that only time and absence can offer. "I kept it," she said, her voice barely above the wind, "because I needed something to prove you were real." I looked at her then, really looked, not through the lens of longing or memory or the soft focus of youth, but as she was now, older, yes, changed, yes, but undeniably, irreversibly her. And I said, "I slept with your letters under my pillow for 40 years. I read them in tents and trains and cities I can't pronounce. I wrote you long after the war ended. I never stopped." She sat down beside me, slowly, and for a long time we said nothing more. The square around us was empty. The wind moved the leaves in soft spirals. The city, loud and living just blocks away, faded like a distant radio signal. And I knew, without needing to ask, without needing to explain, that this moment was not about lost time or second chances, but about the quiet certainty that we had both waited, each in our own silence, for something that neither of us had words for, until now. I did not take her hand, she did not cry, but we were no longer alone. Since that quiet morning in the square, time has moved differently. Not faster or slower, not heavier or lighter, just differently, like the ticking of an old clock rediscovered in the attic, still working after all these years, but with a rhythm that belongs only to itself. I no longer measure days by what I've done or what's passed me by, but by the spaces Marianne and I now share, by the warmth of her hand on mine when the wind picks up, by the quiet sound of two mugs settling on the same table after years of solitary coffee, by the way she looks at me when I read her words aloud from the letters she once wrote. She lives with her niece now, in a small house just outside Providence, not far from where we met again. It's a peaceful place, full of soft light, old furniture, and the scent of dried roses that she keeps in jars on the windowsill. I visit her every week, sometimes more, and we sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, reading from the box of letters we've carried like relics. Some she had forgotten she'd written, some I never dared to open until now. We laugh at our younger selves, at the seriousness of our promises, at the way love, in its earliest form, always believes in forever. And yet, somehow, we were right. We didn't get a lifetime, not the kind with children or mortgages or anniversaries. We didn't get long summers together or arguments over trivial things. We didn't get the slow dance of building a life side by side, but we got something that not everyone finds. We got the return. We got the silence broken. We got to say, without needing to explain, "I waited for you. I remember you. I never let you go. I never did stop writing. Even now I keep a pen nearby, though I rarely use it the same way." The journal stays closed most days, not because I've run out of things to say, but because the person I once wrote to now sits across from me. Her presence has replaced the ache that filled every sentence. Her voice, even when it says nothing at all, has become the punctuation I never knew I needed. Sometimes she asks me if I ever stopped believing I'd find her, And I always answer honestly, no. But I stopped knowing how it would happen. I had imagined everything from chance meetings in crowded libraries to unexpected phone calls after decades. But I never imagined the moment being so quiet, so soft, so filled with the kind of grace that doesn't announce itself. And that, perhaps, is why it was real. We've grown old, yes. Our hands shake sometimes when we reach for the teapot. Our walks are shorter, our nights quieter. But when she looks at me, I see the same girl who read poetry by lamplight, the same girl who tucked her hair behind her ear before saying something brave, the same girl who wrote, "I'll be waiting with lilacs in a jar." And now, on her windowsill, there they are, fresh each week, because she says the promise still matters. This isn't a story about what could have been. It's a story about what was always there, beneath the silence, beneath the years, beneath everything we thought we'd lost. It's a story about two people who never let go. Not really, not where it counted. Because war may have taken our time, our youth and our plans, but it didn't take our love. And that morning in the square wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning, our last and most honest spring. If this story touched you the way it touched me while writing it, please like and subscribe. We share true stories every day, stories that remind us that love survives, that time is patient, and that some promises really are kept.